The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to this IMARC webinar focused on mining in Latin America. My name is Jose Blanco and I'm the Managing Director and founder of Blanco Partners, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Firstly, my apologies for the slightly late start, but the technical gremlins have intervened. Can I just explain that I've been involved with the Latin American markets for over 25 years in a number of roles with the Australia Latin America Business Council, with the Spanish bank Banco Santander, and in doing so I've worked with many Australian companies that have gone to enter Latin America's mining sector. Before I introduce you to our panelists today and start the conversation, I have a few housekeeping items that I need to cover off with you. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and we will be emailing a copy of the recording out to all registrants. So if you need to drop off at any time, don't fear, you will receive the remainder of the conversation in your inbox tomorrow. This session is designed to be an interactive webinar. We'll be running some polls throughout the conversation and we encourage you to take part in those. We also welcome any questions that you may have. Simply type those questions into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. We also welcome any comments you may have that contribute to the conversation. I'm sure that within the audience we have people with considerable experience in Latin America and mining. If you experience any issues with sound, we recommend that you exit the webinar and lock back in. So today I'm joined by a panel comprising Natalia Gorono, the Senior Trade and Investment Director for Latin America of Global Victoria, based in Santiago. Tim Dudley, the Investment Director of Tembo Capital, based in Brisbane. And a late replacement, and thank you very much for doing so, Kate Bennett, a past Director of the Australia Latin America Business Council and co-founder of Somos 21. As you can see, we have a broad range of expertise at our disposal and a huge depth of experience to draw upon, contributing different perspectives on the mining sector in the region. Welcome to all our panelists and to the audience. Well, with that done, let's jump straight into the discussion. I'd like to ask by inviting each of the panelists to provide an overview of where you think the current outlook for mining in Latin America currently stands. So perhaps, Natalia, if I could start with you.
Hi, thank you, Jose. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much for your introduction. And look, I think it depends on the type of minerals that we're talking about. I think that the outlook for copper, especially for investment in Peru and Chile, is very promising. I think Ecuador's budding gold and silver and copper industry also make it a really interesting investment hotspot. When it comes to lithium, Chile will probably continue to lead when it comes to exploration, but Argentina has had very interesting injections of foreign investment, especially over 2018. And when it comes to gold, I think Peru will continue going strong. Last year, Peru topped the charts when it came to the most amount of gold assets acquired globally. So I think that will continue remaining an interesting market. When it comes to technologies as well, I think that Chile, technologies in the mining sector, I think that Chile will continue probably being the most attractive destination for METS companies. And overall, while the US-China war has spooked metal markets a little bit, I think mining is a long-term play, and I think the industry will continue to grow, but maybe not as fast as it has over the past decade. That's my take on where we're going.
Okay, thank you very much. And Tim, would you care to comment? Hello, Tim?
Hello, good morning, Jose, how are you doing?
Good morning. Well, thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, adding to that introduction, I do think obviously the global outlook is increasingly uncertain given the current events and increased trade tensions. That being said, there is substantial shortages in certain commodities, and Latin America plays a key role in many of them, and particularly the ones mentioned are copper and potentially lithium. And then on top of that, we mustn't forget that while there has been some situations that have impacted the market, iron ore production out of Brazil is a very significant component in global trade. So I think the outlook for mining in Latin America is very positive in terms of its contribution to the shortages of supply going forward.
Thank you. And Kate, how do you see the situation?
Well, Jose, I mean, you know as well as I do that I've seen a lot of potential and interest in Latin America dating way back to the 1990s, and it has been a leading exploration destination since then. I think what's interesting is looking at it now and at the region itself taking 30% of the global exploration budget, and within that sort of you've got your 6 key countries. Obviously, the 3 that have been big players and remain large players in the space: Mexico, Peru, Chile, and the style of projects that Natalia was just mentioning. But when we look at moving forward, and they're saying that there's a possibility that there'll be 50% of the global mining investment will be within the region. The additional 3 countries that 90% of that will be those 3, and then Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and as Natalia mentioned, we also see Ecuador coming through. Personally, in terms of exciting prospects in the region, I think Colombia, in terms of the country as a whole, and the stability that it's finding, the interest at a government level to get mining right. There's a huge opportunity there now as they're releasing more zones for exploration. Same with Argentina and Brazil. I know this year they've just released a new, and I'm not one to speak to this topic, maybe Tim or Natalia knows more about it, but more exploration opportunities there as well. So there's a huge amount going on in the region, and as always, it's just how do we get Australia really looking and engaging in that excitement.
It all sounds very exciting. There seems to be no shortage of opportunities in the region, and I think it's interesting to note that that capture of over 25% of the mining exploration budget has not only been in the past year, but I think Latin America has held that level of investment or activity for almost more than a decade. So it's not a one-off. As we're about to proceed with other questions, I'd like to throw up the first audience poll and invite those of you participating to comment on where you see the most exciting prospects for exploration in Latin America. So we'll continue on and give you an opportunity to lodge your votes on that particular question. So I'd now like to move along a little bit and say, within just the exploration phase of the activity in the region, which are the markets that the panelists see the most prospective countries? So perhaps, Kate, would you like to give us your thoughts on that?
The most prospective countries in terms of development?
Exploration.
Exploration. I think Natalia mentioned Argentina and action that's going on within Argentina recently. Colombia also, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there in early stage exploration, because it is a relatively new region. And I think that's the thing, the likes of Mexico, Peru, Chile, that mining's such an important part and has been a long-term part of those economies. The fact that it's Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, these new areas that are huge parts of the terrain that are yet to be explored. For me, I find that personally incredibly exciting.
Okay, all right. And Tim, how do you see it for exploration?
Yeah, I think I'd echo Kate's comments there. Certainly, countries like Ecuador and Colombia offer substantial greenfield grassroots potential for large discoveries, and you can see that the prospectivity there has been seen by a number of major companies that have entered into those countries looking for projects, particularly in Ecuador. But I also think that countries like Chile and Brazil still offer good potential for discoveries, maybe in more challenged environments, deeper undercover, or looking at fields that weren't seen as a particular perspective for a certain commodity. But those 2 countries, I still think have substantial potential for discovery. Okay,
and if we moved across to say the pipeline for development projects as opposed to exploration, Natalia, where do you see the biggest pipeline at the present time?
I think Peru is a particularly interesting market for that. I understand that at the moment they have over $50 billion worth of projects in the pipeline. And I understand the current government is pushing hard to help these projects come to fruition. So I think Peru is very exciting. And then I think and this is as far as projects being developed. And then I'd move back to Chile. I know that Chile's got a pipeline of about 17 billion. Most of these projects are further developments of existing mining operations. So you've got Chuquicamata underground in the pipeline, Antofagasta Minerals, Los Pelambres, and BHP's Spence. So I think that makes it. A really interesting market as well. So I think those two would be my picks.
Okay, it's interesting to see that up on the screen we saw the response to that audience poll about where the audience sees the most exciting opportunities for exploration, and it seemed a good Australian each way bet with Chile, Mexico, Ecuador, and then other unspecified markets each taking 25% of the vote. So clearly there seems to be a lot of upside in a large number of those countries. So obviously, whether it's exploration or development, one of the key requirements is funding. So Tim, you're probably in the best position to give us insights into how the funding environment is at the present time for exploration and development. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the environment is very different for exploration versus development. I think in the exploration space, the current market is very risk averse. We're seeing historical exploration, particularly grassroots greenfield exploration into new frontiers, has been led by the junior end of the market, and the junior end of the market has been suffering from a scarcity of capital, particularly risk capital, at present, with weakness on particularly the TSX, which is the usual funder for junior mining companies operating into Latin America. And within Australia, where the market has been a little bit stronger, it has been very much Australian focused with regards to the investment and activities that have been funded there. So that means that a large amount of the exploration to date has been primarily been funded by large companies, looking with a strategic purpose around particular existing operations, or again on regional scale belts that they and land positions that they have. So yeah, there is a lack of funding and into exploration, which will have a flow-on impact with regards to projects that come through in the next cycle.
Okay.
Saying that, major companies with that are generating cash, are investing in the space. One of our companies that we're invested in, for example, in Brazil, has got 26 rigs running on its property and is investing heavily. And we're seeing the majors such as BHP and Newcrest, etc., enter into Ecuador to do quite frontier exploration work. So there is exploration being done, but it's being led by more established companies and the larger companies across the board. In the development space, I think given that particularly the demand for copper and the interest in, for example, lithium, there is the ability to develop projects if they're at that construction development ready stage, and the substantial amounts of equity capital plus also debt funding that's available to take these projects forward. And certainly larger companies are looking to acquire assets to replace and bolster out their production pipelines to ensure that they can continue to supply into the market, into what's expected to be a shortage in, for example, copper over the medium term.
Okay, all right. Well, look, thanks for those insights. I'd just like to take a moment to remind the audience that we're very eager for this to be an interactive session. So if you do have any questions you'd like to ask of any of the panelists, please avail yourselves of the facility on the webpage to submit your questions. And I see that one has already been lodged about the cost of debt. So Tim, are you able to give any insights on that?
Yeah, well, it depends on the company and the project that's being funded, but certainly there's a reasonable amount of high yield debt that's available to develop projects, and particularly if they're in the hands of a junior company, whereas if it's a senior company, yeah, there is fairly low cost debt in historical terms available to as facilities and revolving facilities for major companies. So there's a range of costs, but it is relatively high in the junior space to develop a project, and can range from the low teens to the high teens, depending on the project and the risks involved in the project.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So clearly it would seem that there are no shortage of opportunities in the region. So perhaps we then need to have a look at what are the main challenges being faced by the mining companies in the region. So Kate, would you like to comment on that question?
Yeah, sure, Jose. Look, I think it's the same thing that's been the block for quite some time. And I always found it interesting when you talk to companies speaking about Latin America and they say, oh, no, it's just too dangerous to go in there. And yet they're quite happily to head on into Africa without giving it a second thought. And so looking at that, and particularly when you break down the differences, the main one being the social license to operate and the power of the communities, in the sense that the indigenous communities within the Latin American region are quite empowered. They do have a voice. When you look at the ILO Convention 169 for rights of tribal people, the entire Latin American region were amongst, they've all ratified that convention. So there's a huge voice for the communities, and they're not afraid to use it. And I think that's the thing, is that it's not necessarily any easier to have those conversations now than it was in the past, but companies are held a lot more to account, both by their investors, by the international community, to ensure that they're doing that correctly.
Okay, and Natalia, how do you see the situation?
So I think that there's probably three main risks to keep in mind. I agree with Kate. I think that community engagement and NGO position is a serious factor to consider. I also think, or the feedback that I've received from friends and colleagues, especially in the exploration space, is permitting delays, and in certain places lack of regulatory clarity. Permitting delays do threaten exploration projects because the delays equate to money, and I've seen a couple of companies lose traction in that sense. So I think those are two to identify. And the third one, which I think is challenging the development of many mining projects, especially in Chile, is water, and the challenge of implementing environmentally friendly practices and technologies. So there's a serious scarcity, which is impacting a lot of Chile's major mines, and that's slowing things down. So if I had to put these three factors on the table by order of priority, I think that the main challenges, especially for exploration projects, would be permitting delays and regulatory uncertainty. The second one for me would be community opposition, so the challenges around social license to operate. And the third one would be environmental considerations, including water management.
Okay, thank you. And Tim, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Natalia that permitting clarity and being able to move projects forward and operations forward, is very key, and that carries a large risk with it. We have seen companies struggle to get permits, and with uncertain permitting regimes in different countries. We've also seen operating companies struggle with maintaining their approvals and extraction licenses. So, in a lot of these cases, the regime and the operating environment is very different, particularly for maybe an Australian mining company or a foreign company coming into these countries, and it can be quite difficult to operate, particularly in Chile, where you have quite an established mining environment and smaller mining companies that do operate probably more on the sharp end of the wedge in terms of permitting and approvals.
Okay, so we've received a question from an audience member who asks us to comment on the political environment in Mexico under the current administration. Would any of the panelists like to voice an opinion on that topic?
So I should declare myself apolitical on this, working with government. But feedback that I have received is that there are concerns with, I guess, safety has been an ongoing concern, and I don't think that's necessarily tied with politicians, but I have heard a number of companies, feedback from both, especially from Canadian companies, which are concerned with safety issues for their staff, and that has an impact on their operations. And the feedback that I do get from the private sector politically is that the government isn't as pro-business as they would have liked to have seen it.
Okay. I'd just like to add that I've always been surprised that given that Mexico has a very extensive mining sector, it really has not received the level of attention from Australian mining companies and even METS players that it perhaps deserves, given the size of the industry. And our companies have tended to focus on the South American continent far more than in Mexico. I don't know that that's due to any political issues, but it's just a reality that we've observed over the years. On this point, it might be opportune to go back to our audience with the second poll, and that is, how does the audience see the social license to operate? And is it becoming harder to secure? So whilst I ask the panelists for their thoughts, if you'd like to vote on this particular topic. So Natalia, do you think it's becoming harder to operate?
I think that's a very mercurial question. I think that if properly approached, social license to operate hasn't become harder to secure. I think it's been demonized a little bit, and big miners have a much better record than what critics claim. So if approached properly, and by that I mean if stakeholders are properly identified before embarking on a project, if sensitivities are well identified, and all parties are informed properly of what's going on and consulted, I think that projects can avoid a lot of the issues around social license to operate. And there is an increasing amount of success cases that are occurring in Latin America. The knowledge brought from these cases is being shared around by government institutions in particular, and I think that's leading to a more constructive and probably educated bunch of stakeholders that are being involved in the creation of projects, and I think that's positive. I think one of the other things that is positive compared to 10 years ago is that governments are taking a much more proactive role in helping find social license to operate. A little while ago, Kate mentioned Convention 169 and Indigenous community consultation. A while ago, we didn't see governments taking the lead on it, and now you see governments, especially like governments like Chile and Peru, being extremely proactive about it. So I think that was one of the problems that we had initially, where 10 years ago we saw a lot of mining operations running into problems. I think another interesting thing is that and this is an opportunity for Australia, we see an increasing number of professionals studying community engagement and conflict resolution. A lot of them are going to Canada, many of them are going to Australia, and they're coming back and applying what they've learned on the ground. And I think that is having a considerable impact. We've seen a lot of our Australian alumni coming back and doing great things on the ground. So I tend to be optimistic about this, but it's mercurial because factors change. So you see things like social media that are becoming more prevalent, and that can also lead to a lot of miscommunication and to perhaps misconceptions. So I think obtaining a social license to operate requires keeping a very close finger on the pulse of communities and changing factors. But overall, I think we're probably dealing with a more informed group of stakeholders than 10 years ago, which is more conducive towards positive outcomes.
Okay, that's interesting to see on the screen now the result of that particular poll, with 60% of audience members who have voted expressing the view that it has become harder to secure the social license to operate. Kate, this is an area that you're very active in. How do you see the situation?
Yeah, well, look, it's funny, and I'm just thinking back now, like Natalia and I actually met at a social responsibility in mining conference back in 2013, and the topic was very much, and that was in Chile, and the topic was very much on the table then. As Natalia said, I don't think it's necessarily harder to secure. I think it depends compared to what. You know, if you look back 20, 30 years, yes, definitely, because there are a lot more, the Indigenous people and local people have more rights now. You've got a lot more pressure on companies, even with the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. Companies have to be showing that they're taking, you know, that they're taking active measures on this front. Governments have to be shown to be taking more of an interest and more active, I guess, stance on these things. And as Natalia says, we see that come into play now with the enforcement of the ILO Convention of free, prior and informed consent and things like that. So it's not that it's harder to secure. I think it's just more visible now when you don't secure it. And I think in the past, companies were able to get through without necessarily securing that. And now that's not an option.
So to the extent that there is in different projects community opposition to mining, what are the key issues that are driving that community opposition? Kate, how do you see that?
Well, I mean, I think it really depends. It depends what stage you're on the project. It depends which region you're in. There's so many different factors at play. Natalia mentioned earlier water and the environment. Obviously, in the early stages, fears around what the impacts are going to be. And largely, when you look at impacts in other parts of the region, water is often something that does get compromised in one way or another. So then those fears and that memory, collective memory of what's happening within the region, they retain that. The community knows that, they hear these things. And so whether or not it's relevant within that particular context, that's the fear that they bring to that discussion. And so there's a lot of hesitancies up front about the environmental risks. You also then have spiritual considerations in some places, and the impact on the spiritual realm for these communities, particularly the ones that are still very connected to their identity. As you move on through development, the focus then can switch, and it becomes more around the jobs and the supply contracts. You know, and are we getting enough or are we not? And so the nature of the community opposition can change depending on what stage in the project you actually are. And then as you become more as a mature operation, opposition then comes in terms of, well, where are the development outcomes? Why can't we see the development outcomes? And so it's really important for companies to understand that having a solid community relationship at one point in the development doesn't secure it for the entire life of that project. And it will continue to change. The community dynamics themselves will change. And that's something that I fear we still aren't getting quite right.
Okay. Natalia, you've already commented to some extent on these particular issues, but I'm curious to firstly ask you to expand on any comments you would like to make, but secondly, to what extent is job creation and also a type of profit sharing behind some of the community opposition, if it is? What do you think?
I think it's a huge factor contributing to positive community engagement and outcomes. I think you see it across the board when there is a participation of communities in a project, when they feel that they belong to it and that they're benefiting from it. There's positive outcomes. So I think that's a key consideration. If somebody's going to be in your backyard, you want to see that they're doing things properly, and you want to be part of the benefit. So that's where you see governments starting to consider leaving tax payments in certain regions. So Peru's doing that quite well. So to answer your second question, I think it's a huge part of getting it right. I think another couple of issues that fuel community opposition to flag are, again, governments not necessarily having the capability to lead conversation, which, while solved in a few countries, in others are still pending. As Kate mentioned, negative precedent. So if one company did something negative in the area, there's a collective memory that things will continue to happen that way. And also, sadly, we have seen cases where there's operators that are very well aware of how to use the system and litigate it for payoff. So I think that would be a third one to add.
Okay. So, Tim, obviously, when projects get to the stage of needing to be funded and move into the development phase, lenders, investors are going to be taking note of the degree of community opposition. How much of an impact does this have on the capacity of companies to raise funding, whether it be for exploration or particularly for development?
Yeah, it's a key component of any due diligence that a company like ours would do, would be to look at the community support and challenges for a project. For a company that's looking to develop a mine and raise finance for that, ensuring the appropriate approvals are in place is a key criteria before the funds are released. And but there is a large assumption that the companies are on top of their community relationships if they're getting those approvals. That may not always be the case, and it can be hard to kind of penetrate down into the actual local environment. I do think that what I have seen is that a big part of the challenge is related to how regionally the economics are spread through the region, as opposed to going into the states from these mining projects. And if the economic benefits are spread correctly and well understood, usually that manages a lot of those risks. But we have seen a lot of projects that have been held up totally on social concerns.
Yeah, well, I think from an Australian perspective, we need to keep in mind that our own backyard is not immune to this question of social license to operate. We only have to look at opposition that arose to the development of the Adani project, etc. So it's not just in Latin America that these issues prevail. So clearly, I think we can conclude that Latin America is highly prospective. It's a destination of great importance to mining companies and to METS players alike. So perhaps we should have a look at what are the strategies that international companies can use to enter into successful partnerships in Latin America, on the basis that often a partnership will help to add the local know-how, the contacts and expertise that are so vital in order to address some of the challenges faced in each of the countries. So can I ask you, for example, Natalia, first up, what strategies would you recommend to an Australian company thinking about looking for a successful partnership in Latin America?
So just to clarify, are you referring to METS companies?
Oh, okay. I think we've got a very broad audience that covers both mining companies, investors, and also METS players. So from whichever perspective you'd like to take it.
Okay, well, I think we focused a fair bit on mining companies, so I might just focus on METS for this question. So you have to be in the market. You have to come to the market as a first step to figure out how to develop a strategy. So my first piece of advice would be visit the market yourself to obtain a sense of the opportunities available for your services or technology. Understand how to enter a new product or service into the mining companies that you consider could be interesting. Every mining company has a different way of taking on new service providers. So that would be my first advice. Come to town and get an understanding of the market. My second piece of advice would be, if you see it's fertile ground, then appoint a local representative or set up shop in market. Across the board, I've seen that it's very hard to do business in Latin America remotely. So companies, especially the majors and the medium companies, expect somebody that they can call on the same time zone, in the same language, should they have any issues. So that would be my second point. My third piece of advice would be, as far as a strategy, maybe consider the medium and smaller mining operations. The majors, so the Codelcos, the BHPs, the big names that always resonate, are saturated with the world's best MET companies providing them with services, and I see that there's always a lot more willingness to receive more services and technologies from the small and medium companies.
Hello. Hello? Hello? Hello?
I can hear you, Jose. Tim.
Okay, so I think it's just Natalia who may have dropped out. So whilst she hopefully returns, I was wondering where the glitch was and what was going on here. Okay, so we just might move on to another question and hopefully be able to return when Natalia is with us once again. So Kate, you've also been involved with companies that have gone into the region. What are the strategies that you think they should consider in order to develop successful partnerships?
Yeah, look, I was thinking a bit about this, and it's interesting because having been, I guess, on the receiving end as well of being approached by companies wanting to service that sector, and particularly that sector in Latin America, it's quite interesting. And I guess you would need to break it down by whether you are equipment, technology, or services. And there's different strategies, I guess, that seem to work or could work based on the context. Everything, obviously, that Natalia said, 100% in agreement. There are certain things, though, for example, technology, like if you've got and we'll notice that a lot of these markets are seeking technology for, say, better environmental management, community management, general efficiency, productivity. If you have a software or a technology that can address that, what I have seen some companies do, which is quite interesting, is appoint an implementation partner. And that implementation partner might be an organization that already has a presence across all of these countries. So your likes of, say, ERM or one, and that's obviously an environmental example. But by having the implementation partner, it avoids you needing to have a presence in all of those locations. Obviously, your technology would need to be designed to support the multiple languages, but in terms of actually having the capability to implement into all of these zones, the concept of having an implementation partner I have seen work quite well. In terms of services as well, again, it would depend on the nature of the services you're offering. If it is an in-country service, yes, 100%, as Natalia said, you need to be there. If, however, you're providing a service that and in a lot of the cases where you've got companies, Australian companies that are operating over there, there is sometimes a desire for the Australian base to acquire that service, an Australian service, but know that they can deliver that in the region. So the highest thing I think, and where we're probably falling down a bit in Australia, is the language capability, and making sure that we have that language capability as, you know, in the first instance. And we're very fortunate that we've got a huge number of Latin American professionals here in Australia that we can draw on to boost that capability. But I think if getting there in the first instance, and obviously Natalia's covered that base, if you're not going to get there, there's some of the strategies that I've seen people use that are equally effective remotely.
No.
This is Natalia.
So
sorry, I'm back on again.
Oh, okay. Welcome back. I don't know if there was anything more that you wanted to add before you dropped out.
I'm not sure.
We
at
were
what
still on
stage
the topic of strategies.
Okay.
Okay.
I think the
All
last
right, well,
thing
look,
I'd add,
Yep.
just very quickly, is leverage the support that trade agencies like the Victorian government can give you. So we can open doors, we can provide market intel, we can overcome barriers. And if there's any Victorian exporters considering Latin America seriously, we've even got office space to help house you as you develop this market. That would be the last thing to add.
Okay, and I think it's fair to also give a plug for the Queensland government has a trade and investment office based in Santiago, and obviously Austrade has a network of offices distributed throughout the region. So there are ports of call, shall we say. Just one final question. Is it fair to say from the comments that you've both made, Natalia and Kate, that it would be very hard for a METS company in Australia to supply a Latin American market without having a local presence?
I'd say
it would be very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, fine. And one of the buzz terms or trends in Australia at the moment is innovation, artificial intelligence. To what extent is there demand in the Latin American mining sector for products that feature innovation or artificial intelligence? And are there specific markets where this is more prominent than others? Natalia, would you care to comment?
Yep, sure. I'd say the demand is increasing, and it's getting to a point where it's quite high. I think that Chile's probably the market that's actually Chile and Brazil would be the markets that are leading on this front. Chile needs to increase productivity, it needs to cut costs, and it needs to mitigate environmental impact. And we see them using innovation and artificial intelligence to try and solve these issues. So as an example, Codelco's already got 18 self-driving trucks operating in Gabriela Mistral, and we see companies like Codelco, AMSA, and VHP on the hunt for innovation. We see this in Peru as well, maybe to a lesser extent. I think one of the challenges of getting these new products in is that the decision makers in mining companies are fairly risk averse. So it takes a bit of pushing to get artificial intelligence and innovation into mines. But I see it moving along, especially in Chile. And I think when it comes to artificial intelligence in particular, Brazil is really interesting. IBM in Brazil is leading this charge, and we see companies like Vale very focused on using artificial intelligence in their projects. So you see them using them for things like predictive maintenance, to find new mineral sources, sensors to anticipate truck movements, etc. So I think it's a really interesting market for AI and innovation. It requires a lot of follow-up. I think that would be my only disclaimer.
And my experience has been that often when you have a new innovation and you approach mining companies, they are sometimes reluctant to be the initial guinea pig for using and proving the value of that new technology. Is it possible to sell new technology to a Codelco if you haven't already sold it to other major mining companies? Does anyone have a view on that issue?
I might just...
Sorry, go ahead, Kate, go.
No, I was just going to say, I think the most important thing is to meet the company where they're at. And so trying to get, as you say, Jose, in your example, if it's a company that's already familiar with it and is in the habit of using that kind of technology, then they're more likely to take it. But what I find interesting is, in a lot of these countries, it's things are still quite basic. And so to go from quite basic or a very I guess a low level of maturity, particularly around even data, and data management, and then have someone come in promoting AI and innovation at a level that's just completely out of alignment with where that operation is at, or where that, I think that's when the problems arise. I think what's interesting, and in exploration phase, there is a big focus on cost. No one's necessarily thinking ahead, and this is a whole nother question, but looking at the life cycle of the mine itself. And so at that point, when they're focused on cost constraint, whatever, they might put systems in place, for example, that don't even allow for automated extraction of data that would facilitate AI and other things. And so there's a whole bunch of considerations that need to be factored in. And I think that if you're a supplier of those things, getting a solid understanding of who you're making your proposal to and where they sit, and truly understanding where they're at and what needs to happen in their journey in order to reach a point where they could take up that technology is really, really important. I think it's a move everyone needs to make, but I think there's less of, and we see this even with agriculture in Latin America, there's less of a push there because in Australia, we've obviously got a high cost of labor. In Latin America, they're not necessarily facing that. So some of those natural pushes to adopting these technologies aren't necessarily there. And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of when we take them in.
Okay, thank you. Natalia, I think you wanted to comment as well?
Yep, so just to complement what Kate said, what I see happening in practice, especially with companies like the Codelcos in Latin America, is that they are willing to take on something new if the service provider is willing to finance a pilot. So I'll see them asking for something like that. I've seen it happen a number of times, and in the few cases when I've seen them take a leap of faith for a very expensive piece of innovative services or technology, it's because they're up against the wall and they've got a very serious issue that they need to solve. So I guess my advice would be you have to be willing to pretty much finance a pilot project if you want to get a footstep in the majors in Chile and in Latin America. The first question they're going to ask you is, where else is it operating in a Latin American mine or a Chilean mine? Where can I go and see it? If not, well, fine, you can install it, but you need to finance the pilot.
Okay. Look, we're coming towards the end of the session, and we heard some comments about the importance of language communication with your target markets in the region. One of the questions we've received is, to what extent are there cultural differences in the way that business is done in the region, both in terms of difference between Australia and the region, and then differences within the countries in the region, if there are any? So, Natalia, you perhaps live this on a regular basis. Do you have any thoughts?
I think, yes, I do. I think that while there's cultural differences with Australia, to answer the first question, Australians are generally really well received. And I think the main frustration that I've seen from Australians is that actually not just Chileans, Latin Americans are very averse to giving you a straight answer, especially if that answer is no. So I think that when it comes to doing business, that's something to be aware of, is that you have to follow up a lot to get a firm answer and to set a firm plan into action if you've actually sold to a client. I think so. The onus would be culturally, it's up to I guess the foreigner, so in this case the Australian, to follow up. And I think that amongst Latin American countries, to answer your second question, Jose, that yes, there are a lot of cultural differences, and this is why I think that you should always work with somebody who's a local and on the ground when approaching a different country. So you'll find that there are a lot of valuable assets. You'll find again that through our alumni, there are professionals that speak both the languages, that have very good networks of connections in each country. I would strongly recommend that you find somebody pretty much in each country to help you navigate those cultural, business and network differences.
Okay. And Kate, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree 100%. The biggest mistake you can make is assume that the whole region is one and the same. So, if you find a Chilean, you think, all right, well, they can, manage things for all countries. And I've found that, yes, Australians are well received, but sometimes Chileans aren't so well received in Argentina, or, there's certain idiosyncrasies between the countries themselves that aren't necessarily what you might expect. So yeah, I would say definitely do not assume that the whole region is culturally one and the same. They are entirely different and should be approached with that in mind.
Okay. And Tim, does the issue also apply in deal structuring and financing?
Yeah, certainly it's the same issues. Obviously, Australians are, quite well received in these countries. But one thing about Australians is that they typically say what they mean and speak quite plainly. Whereas, in a number of these countries, it is very difficult culturally for some different groups to say exactly what they mean. So you can have a lot of miscommunications, and you can push against the door that's actually closed, but you're being told that it's open.
Okay, all right. I think we're close to the very end, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists and the audience for participating in this webinar. I hope that you've all found it worthwhile. This is just a taste of the conversation we'll be having at this year's IMARC, which is taking place in Melbourne from October 29 to 31. IMARC is likely to bring together this year more than 7,000 leaders from the industry and key players in the global mining industry. The discussion will focus on opportunities available in Latin America in the global opportunities stream, which will take place throughout the entire event. Our panelists are going to be attending and participating to varying degrees. So it should be a very, very exciting event. particularly given that this year will focus a lot more attention on Latin America than has been the case in previous year, and that we're likely to see the attendance from quite a number of very high profile industry and government leaders from Latin America at the conference. The conference organisers are offering everyone who participated in this webinar a 15% discount off the cost of registration for IMARC. If you'd like to avail yourselves of this discount, simply register online using the code LATAMWEB. In the meantime, if you want to revisit this discussion, we'll be publishing this recording on Mining Beacon, which is the official content site of IMARC. We'll also email all participants the link once the recording is ready, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. IMARC will, of course, be holding more webinars between now and October to give you further tastes of some of the conversations that will be taking place during the event. So again, keep your eye out for those. The next webinar will look at the next phase for M&A and joint ventures in the mining space. And finally, at the end of this webinar, a short feedback survey will appear on your screen. Please do take the time to let us know what you thought of the conversation and what other conversations you would like to hear in the future. It'll only take a few moments. It'll be very valuable, and it will enhance the value to all of us. So once again, I thank you to all, and I look forward to seeing you at IMARC in Melbourne in October. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose.